This is the True American Podcast. I'm your host. Got a growing audience there, but I still like to say to my listeners why I call myself the True American Podcast. This was the name of a abolitionist newspaper that was started by a Kentuckian, Cassius M. Clay. And so I do that to honor him and honor what he was all about. Today we have a dear friend with me, a brother, Rabbi. Now, Rabbi, am I pronouncing your last name right? Litvin?
Litvin, yep.
Rabbi Litvin. And if you go to my website, booktalkwithcorbin.com, you'll see the one or two other interviews I've done with the rabbi. Whenever I have something I want to know about, get a little deeper understanding spiritually about something, what the Torah is saying, he's my go-to guy. And today I wanted to talk about, Rabbi, how you had gone to Jerusalem, Israel, Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies, and what that school is all about, why you went there, and what you sort of were hoping to accomplish in going to that school.
So Yad Vashem is the Israeli National Holocaust Museum. The word Yad Vashem means memorial in a name. It actually is a quote from Isaiah, in Isaiah 56:5. God promises a memorial in a name.
Wow.
So the idea is Yad Vashem tries to carry on the names of those 6 million martyrs murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an incredible importance to education about what happened in Europe. So the word Holocaust itself is a poorly chosen name. The devastation in Europe was so remarkable that we didn't have a word for it. We didn't have a word for the systematic removal of an entire people, of training, sending them, shipping them across the country and murdering them in factories of mass extermination. There wasn't a word for that. The closest word was genocide. That word had been invented only a couple years earlier to describe what Turkey and the Young Turks were doing to the Armenian population, the mass annihilation. But there wasn't a strong enough word to describe what was happening. The word Holocaust actually means a sacrifice to God, same as Corbin.
Wow.
But that implies that it was in service to God. So Holocaust means totally destroyed by fire. But it's a reference to a sacrifice to God. It probably wasn't the best word to describe this, but simply humanity didn't have a word to describe the evil that the Nazis were doing in Europe, helped by the Poland and Ukraine and American companies, etc. So for a very long time, the Holocaust played a major role in America and in the Western world in combating hate. When then General Eisenhower, who would later become President Eisenhower, saw the devastation, he called for U.S. Army to film things. He said, there'll be a time when people deny this happened. He said, it's so beyond what humanity has done until now that people aren't going to be able to believe this. And so often, when people learn about the Holocaust, they do so through pictures and videos. And it's incredibly important to recognize when we do that, whose narrative are we following? Who was the picture taken by? One of the most famous pictures of the Holocaust is a young man in a casquette and a cap with his hands up in utter terror. And the average person looking at that picture assumes there's a gun on the other side of a camera. Unquestionably, this young man is facing certain death. But actually, that picture was taken by a Nazi officer holding a camera. But the idea of a Nazi officer looking at this child filled him with such dread, it looks like death is ahead of him. So that idea of educating about the Holocaust is so important because, again, we're seeing rising extremism in politics. We're seeing hateful voices in Congress calling for boycotts against Jews, calling for exclusion of Jews. We're seeing radical voices that want to separate people based on their background, their race, etc. And when you have these hateful voices rising again, when you have neo-Nazis marching, and when you have SJP and radical groups on college campuses speaking out against other people, that stark lesson of the utter depravity that man can get to when we don't stand up against evil, when we don't speak out, is incredibly important. And that's why I felt it was important to travel to Israel.
Brother, I want to follow up on a couple of things you said. Number one was that back then, President Dwight Eisenhower had enough wisdom to say, we need to document this, and here's the reason why. It's almost as if he was anticipating Holocaust deniers, or you think he was coming from somewhere else on that?
No, he was openly expecting Holocaust denial. In order to share such a hateful point of view today, you need to explain away history. And you see it with many of the great crimes in history. You see people who say regarding slavery, that, it wasn't that bad, beatings were rare, this and that, because that makes it somehow less bad to enslave another person. Mm-hmm. If you beat them not that regularly. Right. Like somehow that fixes the moral stain. Right. But if, for example, so right now there was a huge news today, Unilever, which is an international company which had thought to join the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement against the Jewish people in Israel, made a public statement today they wouldn't do so, in a huge fail for this anti-Semitic movement. Thank God they had an earlier fail last week when the Fifth Circuit Court certified that the law that was passed here in Kentucky through my and other activists' efforts, and in many other states, that said the state cannot engage in such hateful actions, was entirely constitutional. So that movement are using the same exact terminology the Nazis did. Boycott Jewish stores, boycott Jewish businesses, don't give them your money. Okay. For someone like that, when someone says what you're doing is like what the Nazis did, how could you do that? They have to answer, well, what did the Nazis really do? If you're making that comparison, you have to lower the impact of that claim. For a long time in American politics, the accusation of Nazi was perhaps the worst thing you could say to another person, the comparison to Hitler. And unfortunately, that's changing. And it's changing because radical voices are saying, well, Obama's Hitler, Trump's Hitler, Biden's Hitler, Bernie's Hitler, whoever I don't like, they're Hitler. And it's entirely historically inaccurate. But from a very early time, only years after the Holocaust, anti-Semitic voices were saying that the Holocaust never happened, or the numbers are exaggerated, or the gas chambers didn't exist. In a remarkable moment in the 90s, David Irving, who is perhaps the most published Holocaust denier in the modern era, sued Deborah Lipstadt, who is currently serving as the U.S. Special Envoy combating anti-Semitism, who is then a history professor at Emory University, because she called him a Holocaust denier in her book. So he sued her in England, where the libel laws are a lot stronger to defend against. And the court ruled that he was a Holocaust denier, that he was a liar, that there is so much evidence that he had in his possession that proves what he was saying was wrong, that he wasn't a mistaken historian, he was a liar.
Wow.
And we see that very, very often. But the thing is that when you deny established facts, if I say that the sky is blue, and you say the sky is not blue, you have a reason for lying. You're not mistaken. You're not confused. Someone who's just denying what everyone knows has to have a reason for that.
Rabbi, with you had mentioned some of the radical voices. Like I'm very concerned about this AOC lady in Congress. Not her and the other lady too. I think she's a Muslim sister. And some of the things they say, have you ever heard from them saying some very questionable things about the Holocaust? Or they?
So the squad's usual move is not to deny the Holocaust. Their general move, number one, is to universalize it, to remove the Jews as a central character. The Holocaust was specifically the murder of 6 million Jews.
Yes.
Now, the Nazis murdered many, many more people than that. They murdered dissidents, political dissidents, witnesses, all kinds of minorities, disabled people. But the word Holocaust was specifically crafted to describe their unique genocide towards the Jews. So the idea to universalize the Holocaust, that it's a communal issue. And therefore, any issue I have with the Jewish state or the Jewish people isn't comparable to the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was a human issue, not a Jewish issue.
Okay.
But we've seen lines like all about the Benjamins, which is that the Jews are running the world through money, which is a diet version of Hitler's octopus around the world, the Jewish tentacles that are all over and need to be removed.
Right.
And accusations of blood libels against Israel. One of the members of the squad, a child was missing, and they accused Israel of murdering the child. It turned out 2 days later that that never happened. The whole story was fake. And this congresswoman who had tweeted that out to millions of people never retracted the story.
Yes.
This accusation that Jews are murdering children, which as a blood libel is an age-old anti-Semitic tactic, accusing Jews of the worst crime you could think of, which is the murder of children. So it is concerning. We have that. We have on the other side, I could never have imagined 10 years ago that you would have a Democratic congresswoman appear on a stage with someone who called for the murder of Jews around the world on the same week that a Republican member of Congress was at an event where Hitler was celebrated. So both extremes are terrifying. Generally, when you're speaking the language of extremism, hatred comes very easy to that language, and anti-Semitism specifically, which is a conspiracy theory at its heart, comes very easy to the language of radicals. So we see it in the radical left in America, we see it in the radical right. When you look at Europe, you see it all the more so, as Europe is far more radicalized right now than America. The former leader of the Labour Party in England, Jeremy Corbin, called Hamas and Hezbollah his friends. When he had a shot at the premiership in England, 70% of English Jews said they were scared for their future or were considering emigrating.
Rabbi,
crazy number.
Rabbi, doesn't Hamas, and correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't Hamas flat out in writing call for the utter destruction of the state of Israel?
They go farther than that. They call for the murder of me. I live in Lexington, Kentucky.
Wow.
They call for the murder of me and my children, for Jews all around the world to be killed.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more. Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies, who's allowed to go there and to see the museum and to learn from it and receive training?
So the museum itself is open to everyone and has tourists every day. It is normally one of the spots. So, for example, President Biden is going to Israel in a month and a half. I imagine that one of the first places he'll go is Yad Vashem. It's a regular spot for international visitors. And when I lead groups of students at the University of Kentucky to Israel, it's always somewhere we stop. In addition to the museum, they also have the International School for Holocaust Studies, which is the foremost school addressing Holocaust education in the world. All kinds of groups go there. Every batch of German police officers, before they graduate, fly to Israel and do 2 days at Yad Vashem.
Wow.
A remarkable move that Germany does. And particularly, I went together with a group of college educators from around the world. Specifically on college campuses, we're seeing a huge outbreak of anti-Semitism and a huge outbreak of ignorance about Jews and Jewish history. So I was selected from among, I don't know how many tens of thousands of Jewish professionals on campus that were around the world as the director of the Jewish Student Center at the University of Kentucky. I flew with other campus leaders from Ivy League schools and little schools and schools all across America, as well as from Europe and Australia. And we gathered together and we did a bunch of training online and then some intensive training in person. We were doing about 10-hour days of courses covering everything, covering perspective, not only to receive the information, but how to give the information, because it's powerful information and sometimes very hard to transmit.
Rabbi, First of all, let me state this is a True American podcast. I'm your host. We're talking to Rabbi Litvin right now, Litvin rather, and we're talking about Holocaust Studies at International School for Holocaust Studies in Jerusalem, Israel. Very important discussion. This is something that's really been on my heart to get information out there about. Rabbi, we got just a few more minutes left. Do you think enough's being done here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky in the way of educating folks about the Holocaust?
Absolutely not. It's something we really need to work on. I was blessed a couple years ago to help advocate for the Holocaust Education Bill, which was passed here in Kentucky, named for two Holocaust survivors. It mandated Holocaust education in public schools all across Kentucky. The fact is that there's no benefit or penalty associated with it, and many schools in Kentucky don't teach Holocaust at all. So there's an organization that I'm proud to work with called the Kentucky Educators for Holocaust Studies. And they work with literally any school in the Commonwealth that wants to provide Holocaust education. They'll give them the tools, the resources, and even send out a speaker if they want to speak to them. Mm-hmm. And they can be reached at, the administrator is KEHOS, Kentucky Educators for Holocaust Studies office at gmail.com. And they work with the state legislature. They work with several public schools, private schools to give over that education. But there's a massive dearth of knowledge on the Holocaust. For a long time, the Holocaust was primarily associated with living survivors people could see. You have people like Herman Wouk and Elie Wiesel, who spoke about the Holocaust from a position of knowledge. Elie Wiesel was called the spokesman of the Holocaust, a Holocaust survivor who went on to write dozens of books, was nominated for a Nobel Prize.
Yes.
And people could see him. This is someone. And those people still existed. Former Chief Rabbi of Israel, Yisrael Meir Lau, is a survivor who went from a child in Buchenwald, a child who was marked to death, to be the Chief Rabbi of Israel and meet with world leaders from across the globe. You have here in the Commonwealth still several survivors who are living here. But in addition, there are educators like myself who are trying to pass on not only the history of what happened, but the lessons we need to learn.
Yes.
And it's an incredibly important task.
Rabbi, is it just if a school, if a group of young people, if they just wanted to have, maybe a speaker come in, do a slideshow for an hour or so, is that possible?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
KHOS, the organization I said, the Kentucky Educators for Holocaust Studies, provide that free of charge, and they'd be happy to work with them.
And Rabbi, last question. Up in Cincinnati, there is I heard that there's a Holocaust Museum. Can you tell us a little something about that?
Sure. So the idea of Holocaust museums across the country, there's a national museum in Washington, D.C., and increasingly there are Holocaust museums in many places across the country. In Cincinnati, they have the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. Mm-hmm. It's a remarkable museum that not only talks about the Holocaust, but about hate in general. It's located at the old Union Terminal. That's especially relevant because Cincinnati was a town of German immigrants for a large part. And many Holocaust survivors came to America, got on a train, and arrived at that center, at Union Terminal. So that was the first spot of freedom in America for many Holocaust survivors. And for it now to be a museum to recognize that history is especially meaningful. Yeah. I'm blessed to work with them on several things. We've worked to bring speakers to places in Kentucky. They had a national seminar to combat hate right before the pandemic. So it feels like yesterday, but it was 2.5 years ago that I was blessed to represent the Lexington community at. And they are open and advocating for people to join, the people to come and get educated.
Well, Rabbi, we're going to conclude here. I hope and pray that this interview, and I'm going to really get it out to as many people as possible, motivates some educators to ask you or other brothers to come in and talk about the Holocaust to our Kentucky youth, to our young people here in Louisville, and maybe even establish some type of center here. I mean, I know Cincinnati's only an hour away, but I don't know. I love my Kentucky, and I just wish we had something right here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and not just one, but several. I mean, I love my Kentucky. My Kentucky's got to be. They have to have something like that here. I just really wish that we can get something like that going here. Rabbi, I appreciate your time today. I hope we can do this again sometime. And do you have any parting words of wisdom for us?
I would encourage people that are educated. There are wonderful resources. The U.S. Holocaust Museum is a great website. Yad Vashem is a great website. If you're looking for a speaker, I will personally come out to help anywhere in the Commonwealth. And if we do not educate about the Holocaust, if we do not educate about the lessons of the worst that humanity can do, about the horrors that happened in Europe, that countries knew about, that America knew about, that President Roosevelt knew about and ignored, that Western Europe knew about and ignored, and where 6 million people lost their lives in extermination. If we don't learn those lessons and learn that history, we allow the steps towards that to happen without being recognized. And we all have a moral responsibility, not only to get educated, but to raise our voices, to advocate, to ensure nothing like this happens in the future.
Rabbi, thank you. We'll be in touch, Rabbi.
God bless you, my friend.
Yes, sir.